Hey, this is Danny here from Podcast Stories. Thanks so much for listening, and I'd love for you to get the latest episodes when they're released. So make sure to follow on your favourite podcast app or hop on over to podcasterstories.com/listen. If you enjoy the show and want to support it, you can do that at podcasterstories.com/support to join other supporters just like you. Thanks so much for being part of the Podcaster Stories community. And now, here's this week's episode.
I think a lot of it boils down to we as humans don't have proper boundaries in how we live. And the boundaries of what we consume, not just food, but the information that we consume. Right now is a stressful time. And if we're watching the news several hours a day, we're consuming a lot of negative information. And that stresses people out. It concerns us. As governments open things up and then close things back down again, that's stressful for many people because they're worried. They have fear that they could lose their job, there could be an income drop in their household, they won't be able to do the things that they like doing. With the holidays coming up, there's a lot of concern of, will I be able to go home for Christmas or see loved ones for the holidays or whatever holiday you observe? It's really, really problematic, and that stress builds up.
Hi, and welcome to Podcaster Stories. Each show will have a conversation with podcasters across all mediums and share their story, what motivates them, why they started their show, how they grew their show, and more. We'll also talk about their personal lives and some of the things that have happened that have made them the person they are today. And now, here's your host, Danny Brown. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Podcaster Stories. This week I have Michael Levitt, host of the Breakfast Leadership Show, which looks to help leaders reduce stress and prevent burnout and focus on what really matters the most. So Mike, welcome to the show. I really appreciate you being here. How about you introduce yourself and a bit of background about your show?
Thank you so much, Danny. Glad to be here. So again, Michael Levitt, I'm the host of the Breakfast Leadership Show, and I launched the Breakfast Leadership Network several years ago to address burnout. And I started off working with C-suite executives, but I've expanded that to working with organizations that want to improve the mental and physical well-being of their employees, because burnout takes a huge toll on every organization, and with lost productivity, absenteeism, maybe even lost employees because they have to go out on mental or sick leave or potentially leave your organization altogether.
And that's definitely something that we'll be speaking about in the show. I think it's important as well, with today being World Mental Health Day, that, as you mentioned, we can lose employees and colleagues through stress and burnout, not just from a sort of taking time off work, which I think everybody tends to think of, or the stress, giving them some time off, but obviously it causes a lot more issues than just time off work.
Oh, definitely, and thank you for acknowledging Mental Health Day. It's a big challenge, and we're seeing a lot of issues, especially during this pandemic, where a lot of people are struggling with work and life and everything in between, and it's not a good time for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are some things that we all can do to help ease the stress and keep our mental wellness a top priority.
Now, you mentioned that obviously the pandemic, and my wife, funnily enough, sent out a newsletter this morning where she mentioned the mental health effects of the pandemic and on people in general. How much of obviously the pandemic's had a huge impact on people globally. How much do you think's actually being recognised by, say, workplaces? I know a lot of workplaces are now moving to a remote-only option. Microsoft just announced that they'll be fully remote now if people wish to do that. How much do you feel that workplaces still need to get up to speed with what's happening when it comes to, stress, burnout, and mental health with this pandemic, I guess?
There's a couple stats that I'd like to share. One, Monster.com did a study earlier in the summer, and they indicated that 69% of those surveyed employees are identifying as being burned out. So that's roughly 7 out of 10 employees are dealing with some type of burnout right now, much of it due to working remotely and working from home and trying to juggle all the things that we're doing and not spending the time to separate work and home. Because before, for many of us, if we weren't working from our home, there was basically segments in our day. We would get up in the morning, we would go to work, commute, whether driving or taking a subway or something like that, working, and then taking a break at lunch and whatever coffee breaks and whatnot, leaving, going home, and then you'd have this separation. Well, now everything's in one spot. And so many people are just getting up first thing in the morning and they just start working. And they work late into the evening every day because of Zoom calls and everything else that's going on. And congratulations, so many people became full-time school teachers as well because their kids were home because the schools were closed. And it's really created a lot of challenges. Another study indicated that 54% of employees feel that the HR department are not doing enough to address their mental needs. Now, some organizations are starting to look into this, but they need to get ahead of it because for the longest time, and burnout was around before this pandemic. I've been talking about burnout for years, and I have a book that was written and published in 1980 called Burnout. So it's been around a long time, but it's getting attention now. And the challenge that we're seeing is so many people are dealing with this burnout, and organizations ignored it for the longest time because they didn't see a direct impact on the bottom line. They didn't see it in the financial statements. But I guarantee you they will, because this year alone, in talking with a colleague of mine who's in the insurance industry, the mental health claims and the insurance claims for mental health related matters are skyrocketing. So what that means is the claims are going to exceed basically what your benefits package was set up as. So next year, when it comes to renewal time, many employers are going to be paying much higher insurance premiums because the claims went so far up on the mental health side of things. That's going to impact the bottom line, and that can be prevented by organizations if they take a more proactive approach in addressing the stress and well-being that so many of their employees are facing, and not just handing them an EAP brochure and say, here, you can call somebody toll-free and have a chat with them. We got to go beyond that. There's more investment that employers need to do for the well-being of their employees.
And I think that ties in really nicely to, you'd mentioned that you wrote a book back in 1980. Was it 1980 or 20 years ago? Sorry.
1980, I hate to do the math, that was 40 years ago.
40 years ago.
It feels like about 5 years ago, because I remember 1980 pretty clearly, but I had hair back then too. So completely different world, but not really. It's been around a long time, but it's definitely more it's more talked about, because I think mental health is being more talked about. The stigma, while it's still there, is easing up. And I think, like in Canada, for example, Bell Let's Talk, that has brought a ton of awareness. And there's key people in the world that have publicly indicated that they've had some mental health challenges. And they are strong advocates to say it's okay to say that you're not okay and get the help that you need. And because you want to be the healthiest version of yourself. We have no problem going to a doctor if we have an ailment or indigestion or some type of physical ailment. It should be the same way if there's something going on as far as how we're feeling and what's on our mind and our thoughts and behaviors, and getting those addressed to make sure that we're the best version of ourselves is critical and crucial, and everyone should encourage it.
Now, I know your background is in healthcare, and I was reading on your site when you were mentioning these stats from Monster elsewhere earlier. I know on your website you've got a stat that really stood out for me from the World Health Organization about occupational burnout, and the numbers from your own time in healthcare and the numbers coming out from the WHO is 75% of patients that you saw cited stress as the reason they were there. And that's a pretty scary number. I mean, you mentioned 7 out of 10. That's even higher, like 7.5 out of 10, of occupational burnout. What do you think are some of the key factors in this, both from your time in healthcare and the people you speak to, on your show? And how do we get that back under control, do you think?
I think a lot of it boils down to we as humans don't have proper boundaries in how we live. And the boundaries of what we consume, not just food, but the information that we consume. Right now is a stressful time, and if we're watching the news several hours a day, we're consuming a lot of negative information, and that stresses people out. It concerns us. As governments open things up and then close things back down again, that's stressful for many people because they're worried. They have fear that they could lose their job, there could be an income drop in their household, they won't be able to do the things that they like doing. With the holidays coming up, there's a lot of concern of, will I be able to go home for Christmas or see loved ones for the holidays or whatever holiday you observe? It's really, really problematic, and that stress builds up. But as far as the cases of what we saw when I was in healthcare and primary care, with all of the stress, again, it's improper nutrition. And not getting enough rest. If you eat better, and I'm not telling people just eat kale salads all day and night. That's not what I mean. I highly recommend everybody find a nutritionist or a dietitian and work with them to figure out the right foods for you, because each of us have some type of food intolerance. So if you can find the right foods for you that provide you the natural energy that you need to have a sustainable energy level throughout your day, so you don't have to hit that 2 p.m. Red Bull or cup of coffee, that will make you feel better because your body won't need all the extra stimulants, which creates the imbalance, rises and crashes and all of that stuff, which does cause physical stress on our bodies. Couple that with sleep. So many of us have horrible sleep, and when we get deep sleep, that's when our body repairs all the damage that we do to ourselves on a daily basis. And if we're not sleeping well, then today's damage gets piled on to tomorrow's damage, and it just continues. And then you start seeing physical ailments. Gut bacteria, for example, if you're not eating properly, can create problems. The diabetic population continues to increase, and I just saw literally about a half an hour before we jumped on that the metformin, it's a heavily prescribed drug for diabetes, has been recalled because there are cancer-causing agents in that medication. So here's a medication trying to help people, and congratulations, we're keeping your diabetes under control, but now we've just introduced the possibility that you're going to have cancer. So welcome to chemo and radiation. And a lot of that is driven by how we take care of ourselves, our activity, and what we eat. Now, some people, in working in healthcare, there are some cultures that unfortunately are prone to get type 2 diabetes. They can be healthy, have all the right indicators, but unfortunately, just their DNA makeup and the culture where they came from can create those situations. So that's always concerning when I see a majorly prescribed medication being recalled, because I'm thinking, how many millions and millions of people are taking that? And again, that causes stress. So if you've got a chronic disease, you're stressed. And actually, the key thing about stress is there are, I believe the number is 26 chronic diseases that stress is actually an element as a potential cause for that chronic disease. Hypertension, high blood pressure, all of these things. So if you don't control your stress, you're creating scenarios where you could end up with several chronic diseases. And again, unfortunately, and again, primary care, we saw people that had 4 or 5 different chronic diseases, which means, as a physician, there's all kinds of prescriptions that are being written for these people instead of gravitating them to better nutrition, more activities, and things like that. And I know that they can get off of those medications. I'm a perfect example. I had my cardiac event back in 2009 with my burnout and all of that stuff. And I'm off all my heart medications. I don't take them anymore because I'm taking nutrients, and I've worked with nutritionists and naturopathic doctors and all of that, and getting proper exercise and eating vegetables. Here's a pro tip. At the grocery store, shop the perimeter. Try to limit, by all means, there's things in there, spices and things like that you want to cook with, that's great, but try not to make sure that the majority of your food comes in a cardboard box. That's not good for you.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned about the food and nutrition. There was a meme on Facebook a while back, and it did the rounds quite a bit, and it was comparing the price of, as you mentioned, buying healthy foods, so vegetables, the proper carbohydrates, the proper proteins, etc. And then you compare that to like a bottle of pop or a fast food joint McDonald's meal, and you could get a McDonald's meal for $3, and for the equivalent amount of protein, etc. Obviously, McDonald's isn't healthy protein, but that's by the by. But it costs about $25 to get the same amount of, say, fresh veg, good milk, stuff like that. So I know a lot of governments, especially with the pandemic, that's they're really looking at ways they serve their communities, the people that put them into power. And one of the things is universal basic income, for example. And that's a great start. But do you think there needs to be, and going back to your point, how you got off your medication through proper nutrition, exercise, and really looking after yourself, do we need to put as much emphasis on making junk food more expensive than the healthy food, especially for lower income families where they switch to the junk food because that's all that they can basically afford?
Yeah, I think there's definitely ways to look at that but I have noticed, and I'll pick on the Golden Arches for a minute. They do have healthy food options. You just have to know what to order. But on one of their meals, for example, if you order the number 3 with a Coke, for example, that's going to run you, in Canada, $12, maybe $13. It used to be $4 or $5. Now it's $12 or $13. And I have found that you can shop. I went to the grocery store this morning and hit up the veggie aisle, fresh meats, lean meats, all of that kind of good stuff. And dividing that by the number of meals that I will get out of that food is considerably cheaper than ordering number 3 with a Coke or anything like that. So it's just understanding how to prepare meals and things like that. And the advent of the internet, the beautiful thing is, and even there's so many of these meal box systems that are out there as well that can help you kind of guide yourself to preparing meals that are healthier, fresh ingredients, finding the nutrients that work for you. And I know some people say they don't have time, but here's what they'll do. They'll get home from work and they'll use a food ordering app and have somebody deliver the food for them. I cooked dinner last night, and I had the veggies, I had starches, I had lean meats. I was done in 22 minutes. And ordering a food app, you're waiting 30 to 45. So they say, well, it's quicker to order. Maybe if you're driving to there from work and picking it up, or even leaving your house and going there and coming back, I find that it's actually quicker to make your own meals. On top of that, it's one of those things, and this is one of the things where I think a lot of people get in trouble with stress, is they multitask. They try to do too many things. When you're preparing a meal, and I'll be honest with you, I have not been someone to cook meals up until probably the last 4 or 5 years. Actually, I'd say probably closer to 3 years. I find it very therapeutic to be cutting up the vegetables, getting them prepared, whether I'm going to grill them or eat them raw or whatever the case may be, preparing the meats, preparing if I'm having potatoes or rice, taking care of all of those things. It's very therapeutic because you need to pay attention to what you're doing, especially if you're using a knife, okay? Now, I still have all of my digits. I haven't cut them yet, knock on wood. But there's something about that. It's almost a self-care type of thing for me where it's like I enjoy cooking. I enjoy preparing things. I like experimenting with some things. And I like tasting food. And you can't really taste fast food. I mean, it's got flavor, of course, but anymore you eat it and check how you're feeling. How's your energy levels? How's your gut? And all those things. And again, a big component of stress, and we're starting to see more and more studies about this, is your gut activity, your gut bacteria. For many of us, when our generation, we were overprescribed antibiotics, and there's studies showing that has impacted our ability to have a clean digestive system. So that's why you start seeing the need for antacids and all of those types of things, because the gut bacteria that we need to break down the foods and properly, divvy the things up to what they're supposed to do inside our bodies has been eaten away a little bit. So your body's going, I don't know what to do with this stuff, so it sends it back up, and you get acid reflux, and it's a fun thing to have. But again, all of these things, like acid reflux, for example, sometimes that flares up at night, and it could flare up while you're sleeping. It wakes you up if you have it. Well, guess what? You've been interrupted with your sleep, so you're not repairing the damage to your body because you're not getting good sleep. So that's why nutrition is such an important thing, and again, why I highly recommend people to work with a nutritionist or a dietitian to figure out what are the right foods for you so you can live a better, healthier life and have more natural energy instead of the stimulants that we all use and choose.
Now, I know your Breakfast Leadership Show, that's been going since 2017, I believe?
Correct.
Yep. has the experience lived up to your expectations, and what's been different from what you might have expected, when you first started the show?
Yeah, when I launched the show, my original intent for the show was I didn't really have a plan to interview anybody. I was just going to have basically little 5 to 10 minute snippets on ideas on how to reduce stress and reduce your burnout and things like that. And in the first 50 or 60 episodes of the show was just that. But then I was encouraged by a good colleague of mine to say, you should interview guests. So I started, and it's blown me away, the fun conversations that I get to have with people across the globe on a variety of different things. Yes, burnout is one of them, but the show has kind of taken on a direction of these are successful entrepreneurs or successful people in life that are doing great things, and they share their story as to how they got there. Because so many people want to do something different in their life than they're doing right now. So it provides them some insights behind the curtain scenes of how individuals were able to adjust and pivot and grow in their organizations to get the growth that they want, to be where they want to be. Some of them are not where they want to be yet, but they're still growing and doing some great things. And it's been amazing, the reaction that I get, some of the feedback that I get. I get international rankings. I scratch my head and say, why am I so popular in the UK? Here I am. I'm a dual citizen. I split time between the United States and Canada. I'm like, why is the UK listening to me? And and I'm thankful. Believe me, I'm thrilled that anybody listens to my show. It's a good thing. But it's entertaining. It's fun because I've gained so much professional and personal growth from the conversations I've had, having interviews that are I'm being interviewed, and obviously the ones that I've held myself. You just gain so much knowledge. And when people are, and I know a lot of people are familiar with podcasts now more so than they were even 3 years ago. And when I explained to people that had never listened before, I said, the beautiful thing I like about podcasts is if you love talk radio, imagine just being able to listen to a station or several stations on the exact content you want. Because if we listen to talk radio, in an hour, there may be 4 segments, maybe 5 segments, and there's going to be maybe 1 or 2 of those segments that are interesting to us, and then the others we're like, I'm not going to pay any attention. But with this, you can pick and choose and say, I want to listen to this type of content. And again, it's for growth. And of course, there's comedy and entertainment shows and things like that. And I know a lot of people listen to those things too. Make a good harmonious balance with things because as a world, we definitely need to laugh more, especially during a pandemic. But long story short, I love the medium. I know it's got a lot of growth coming. Because there's so many new players that are coming into it, which is going to drive people into it. And it's a great creative way to do it. And what I find best about it is, and just kind of behind the curtains thing for me is it took me a while to get my feet around when I should do interviews because I was doing them every day and it was kind of scattered and all of that. And then one of the things that I do for my own stress reduction and prevention is I have themes for every day of my week. So on Mondays, I'm a public speaker, so I do a lot of public speaking engagements, all of them virtual now. My luggage misses me, but they're all virtual. But Mondays are the days that I do research on that and reach out to event planners and line up some speaking events. Tuesdays I use for intro calls or follow-up calls. Wednesdays are my podcast show recording days. That's usually the day I record. Unless someone can't do it on a Wednesday, then I've got some flexibility. And then Thursdays and Fridays, I don't schedule anything. I leave those open for those last minute, hey, can we jump on a call this week? And typically I can say, yeah, how's your Thursday or Friday look? I keep those open. I'm thankful that, and it's taken time for me to figure that out, but I know by having themes for every day of the week, I don't have to think about really anything differently. I know, okay, today's Monday. My focus is on speaking. Tuesdays, let's have some calls and learn some new things about people. Wednesdays, I'm wearing this thing and doing what we're doing right now. And then Thursdays and Fridays can be a little bit more, I don't want to say chaotic, but they'll have a lot of different flavors to them based on what has come up from the week. And by doing that, I don't have to shift gears and do different things all the time. And I think that's something, and most people can do that, even if they're working for an organization. I think it's a good idea to sort out and figure out, where, the work makes sense during your week. And you work with your manager and say, hey, I got an idea, I want to try this. And what will happen is, okay, Wednesdays I work on the financials, or Thursdays I work on follow-up calls, or whatever makes sense for you. By doing that, your brain is working on like-minded tasks, so it's not so hard to shift gears into doing different things. It makes it a little bit more organized, and I think by doing that, it helps reduce a lot of the stress of switching gears and multitasking and all of that.
Now, speaking of stress, and I know you'd alluded to it earlier, your medical event back in 2009, you had quite an adventure, for want of a better description. Yeah. You had a heart attack, but you also had some personal stuff that happened at the same time.
Yep.
And I can only imagine how all that combined, would have affected you. So what happened there, and how did you react, I guess?
Yeah. So real quickly, in 2009, after being a healthcare executive at a startup healthcare organization for a couple of years, over a period of a year, 369 days, from May 2009 to May 2010, I had a heart attack that should have killed me. I lost my job during the Great Recession. My car was repossessed and my home was foreclosed, all in a year. And why did those things happen? Because I was burned out. I was so burned out I wasn't taking care of myself. My nutrition plan was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Talking into a microphone, driving around the corner, paying, and getting handed a brown bag. That was my meal plan, because I was working so many hours in this, ironically, healthcare organization. I wasn't taking care of myself. Healthcare organizations tell people how to live their lives, but here I was not walking the walk. And then after you lose your job during the Great Recession, there wasn't a lot of jobs available in that area that I was in. And, congratulations, now you're on all these heart medications. It was costing me $1,000 a month because I didn't have any drug insurance coverage. And I was on unemployment, which means a lot less income coming in. You have to pay for food for your family, and all of a sudden $1,000 a month for drugs. And not the fun kind of drugs, but the stuff that keeps you alive. Maybe I should have taken those instead. Probably could have felt better. I don't know. I'm not judging, or saying yes or no. But end of the day, when you do that, it impacts your ability to pay other bills. And of course, I worked with all of our creditors, and they all gave us grace, for a period of time. But unfortunately, that grace period ran out, and the bank exercised their right to take back the vehicle and foreclose the home. And I don't blame them. We had an agreement. I didn't live up to the agreement, of course, of circumstances. But at the end of the day, I couldn't pay bills. And if you can't pay bills, they have a right to take that stuff back, and they did. But all of those things happened because I was burned out and I wasn't taking care of myself. So after surviving all of those things, I had a choice. I was like, well, I survived them. I must be Superman. I'm not going to change a thing. Or I realized I never want to go through a year like that ever again. What do I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen? And I did a lot of deep work and a lot of reflection and intro, just kind of looking in. And I did it in a caring, loving way. So I'm very thankful that some people very close to me told me, it's like, look within, but don't judge. Just observe, the choices and the behaviors and the thoughts that you did that led up to that year of worst case scenarios. And then from there, see what areas you can make adjustments in to prevent that from happening again. And that's what I did. For me, I made the choice to completely reinvent myself. Now, for most people that are burned out, I don't want to scare them. No, you don't have to reinvent yourself. The majority of people don't. They have to make some adjustments in their lives on a couple things, and that can make a big difference. And even stopping burnout doesn't take a lot to stop it. Get good sleep, eat better, get active, control your inputs of what you're watching and consuming. Rest, be thankful for things that you're thankful for. Especially on this Canadian Thanksgiving weekend. Be thankful. Even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, there's still a ton of things to be thankful for. And focus on that. And that can stop the burnout. But then the deeper work people need to do is to determine what led up to the burnout in the first place. What were my thoughts, my beliefs, my habits, those things? And that takes a bit more work because you have to look within, and a lot of people are very afraid to do that. But if you do it with love, love yourself, because you're never with anybody more than yourself, ever. Even if you have a sidekick that's always at your side, you're still, you live with yourself every day of your life. So you got to love yourself and look and see why those things happen. And I recommend, if you're having difficulties with that, to work with a therapist to guide you through that. I didn't in those early days. I did the work myself. I think it would have been beneficial for me to work with a therapist earlier. I think it would have expedited some things and probably provided a little bit more clarity on some things that took a little bit longer for me to figure out. But at the end of the day, I'm living the ideal life now, and I'm happy to be alive, obviously, and help others, navigate their burnout journey as well.
And were you ever concerned, if you like, because obviously, as you mentioned, you had to reinvent yourself. There was certain decisions you had to make to really avoid what had happened in the run-up to your event, your health issues. Mm-hmm. Were you ever concerned that as you were going through the rebuilding process, that you may be taking on more stress or more burnout because now you're having to start from scratch? You've got bills to pay, you've got responsibilities, but you've also got a new life, again, for want of a better description, to build. And were you ever concerned that you may end up back at square one because of what you're now taking on?
Early on, yes, I was concerned that burnout would creep back in. But thankfully, I knew the signs of burnout at that point. I certainly didn't know them before, although they were all there. And loved ones and friends and family tried to warn me, but I wouldn't listen to them. And I think that was a big mistake on my part. I could have potentially headed off so many of those losses if I would have caught it and started doing things differently. Who knows about the cardiac event? That could have been something that could have come up. At least I could have potentially been put on some medications to unblock the arteries and things like that, so I wouldn't have had to have the heart attack. But that's hard to say. But once starting anew and rebuilding, I looked at it, and this is a mindset thing, I looked at it from a point of curiosity. And I was intentional about choices and thoughts. And literally, of course, it slows things down a bit, which I think is a good thing for many of us, is when I made a decision or if I reacted to something, I would pause and say, okay, why am I either happy about this or why am I upset about this particular moment? And I'll be honest, I even had this conversation with my better half and myself earlier today, regarding this pandemic and governments closing things down and really impacting businesses and families, and wondering, okay, is a blanket approach to close everything down the right thing to do, or should they be more pinpoint on the problem areas instead of just doing a blanket closing of everything? And really struggled with that and was borderline upset about the situation. But upon reflection, looking at it going, okay, I think as a society and everybody should look to whatever decisions are being made by others as their intent is to do the best that they think that they can do at this moment with the information that they have, and go at it in a non-judgmental way. And it's easy for us, especially with social media and everything else, and U.S. presidential elections. It's just, there's all kinds of stress going on all over the place, and we're very quick to judge and say they shouldn't do this, and get on our soapbox and start pointing and yelling. Doesn't help anything. It doesn't make things better. All it does is it builds up our stress. And I, thankfully caught it. It took me a bit because sometimes I'm slow when it comes to things like that. I got a history for that. But at the end of the day, I realize, okay, what can I do? What are things that I can do to deal with this situation? Okay, if I'm concerned about, we'll pick on restaurants, because a lot of in Toronto, all the restaurants are being closed for indoor dining as of today. So in that situation, I can still order food from my favorite restaurants. They're still open for takeout. Obviously, pick nutrition foods and all of that. But again, it's one of those things where, for me, it was being empathetic for the potential losses that business has and the people that work for it and the ripple effect. And it goes back, and I'll be honest with you, it's a trigger because it brings me back to my experience of losing everything. And I don't want people to go through that. That's why I do the work that I do. I don't want people to have burnout create those scenarios where they could lose their job, their car, their house, have to relocate to a brand new community and leave friends and family behind. That's not pleasant. And I don't want people to go through that experience. That's why I stand on my soapbox and say, burnout is dangerous. You don't want to mess with it.
Now, your show, we mentioned earlier, your show is 3 years old, or it's a little over 3 years old. And obviously, you mentioned you've got listeners in the UK that, get in touch with you, and it's really grown the way you want it to. What are your goals for the future of the show? I know you mentioned it came from just being yourself, talking about some topics. Now it's the Breakfast Leadership Show where you're talking to people every episode. What's your goals, for the show and its direction?
I think for the next few years, especially with what's going on in this pandemic, is there's a lot of potential that I probably need to have either some spin-offs of the show to focus more specific on separate items. Health obviously is a big concern of mine for people. Maybe doing a focal point on that. Small business, the heart and soul of so many countries. That's why I bring in a lot of people to help small business leaders to grow their businesses and do things and learn from experiences of others. And then obviously the burnout side of things, making sure that there's tips that people that are hearing again and again on how to quickly stop burnout and then start doing the deeper work to figure out why you burned out in the first place. That's why I'm a certified CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and neuro-linguistic programming NLP therapist. I went out and got those certificates because what I was finding and working with people and teams is a lot of the situations that led to their burnout, including myself, was their thoughts, their beliefs, their behaviors. And that's why, getting certified in those two practices has been really helpful for me to be able to guide people to look within and see, okay, why do you think you burned out? Okay, what were the ingredients? What were your choices? Why did you react that way? And get them thinking about some things so they recognize, okay, my thoughts on this led me to make these choices, which turned into this situation, which created this situation, which led me to have prolonged stress, and prolonged stress turns into burnout. And it's been really helpful for insights to me as why people burn out, and more importantly, what they can do to get out of it and crucially, prevent it from happening again.
The spin-offs sound really cool. It sounds like on the first episode of this season, I was speaking to a couple of ladies, Janelle and Rachel, and they have like a spin-off of their show where they concentrate on sharing untold tales of Black, Indigenous, and people of colour's stories, which I think is really cool to see podcasts move away, as you mentioned, to your own podcast, to move away from, say, the core, not really move away, that's still the core message, but still have these little offshoots. I mean, you see it on TV all the time. You have, main episodes on, say, Amazon or Netflix, and then you have little spin-offs. So the Star Wars movie, you've got like the Solo movie or Rogue One or whatever. And I think it's interesting to see podcasters do that, because I think, yourself, a lot of the time podcasters don't get taken seriously. We're little geeks in our basements or our bedrooms, kind of like the video game quoters back in the 80s. So it's really cool to see you move into that direction as well. And so what you go with that? Are you looking to launch some of that next year? Is it like a 3-5 year plan? Or?
Yeah, I'm going to start looking into it for 2021 for sure, because I've got a backload of interviews that are coming up over the next month or so. I tend to take the entire month of December off, so I don't do hardly anything. I dabble in little things, but I started doing that a couple of years ago just for my own well-being and self-care. It's like it's a good way for me to reflect on the year and look and do some, business planning and whatnot. It's not like I just sit on the couch and stare at the television and watch college football bowl games all the time, which I will do. Although I don't know how the bowl games are going to be this year because they started so late. And who knows? I haven't looked that far ahead, but I anticipate there'll be something for me to consume. But when you take a break and get away from your normal work pace, that's when clarity can come in. And even if you have a really structured work day and things like that, and giving yourself a ton of self-care time and whatnot, it's going to allow me to start thinking about that. And the spinning off of the show has been back of mind for several months now. And with the organization, the name of it being the Breakfast Leadership Network, that tells you it's a network. That means there's other things to it. And I have the media arm, I've got the speaking arm, the podcast, the writing and content creation, and all of that is kind of the umbrella on it. But I think other shows go into it, and there's distinct possibility that I could bring on additional host to host something along one of those channels and say, okay, this is part of the Breakfast Leadership Network. They talk about this subject, and they niche down, depending on how you say the word, in that particular row or column, I should say. And it gets spit off. So those are things that have been top of mind for a while, and I'll kind of hash it out. And as with anything that I tend to do, I try to have it go organically. Yes, I kind of guide it on certain things, but I think that there's opportunities here for me to say, okay, let's start focusing on this, and still do the interviews that I do. And when I see someone coming in, okay, it's an author, they're writing about employee wellness and this, it's like, okay, that could go into a health segment, or that could go into a business segment, again, depending on how the conversation goes. But segue it into those things, and just tell my podcast editor, okay, use this intro and outro for this one, and we're good. But I think that's probably the direction I think the show is going to take. I'm very fortunate I get to talk to amazing human beings globally, all over the world, and from former orchestra directors to people that worked at NASA to incredible business thought leaders to billionaires to you name it. And it's wonderful. And this from being a host, and anybody's listening that ever wants to launch their own show, is you can get access to people that would be very difficult in the quote-unquote old days to talk with them. All of a sudden, you get them on your show, you're having a one-on-one conversation. And I've had some conversations with people that I've had their books for over a decade, and I'm interviewing them, I'm talking to them, and I'm picking their brain. And I'm asking them, what about this? What about this? And they're all gracious with their time, and they tell you, here's this and this and this. And those little nuggets that we can all give each other on our experiences make such a huge difference in moving people forward to the next level that they want to get to. And I'm a big fan of, the pie is so big, not any of us can eat all of it. There's so much of it. Let's bring everybody there and eat the pie and enjoy, and hopefully, and there's different flavors too. So if you hate pumpkin pie and you love apple pie, there's that too. There's plenty of it. So I make it a point to, whenever I can help people with anything that I know something about, or know somebody that does know something, I'm more than happy to help them out, because it just makes the world better.
Yeah, which I think we definitely, as you mentioned, at this time, especially with the pandemic and people being either on their own because of isolation or not being able to connect with the people they normally would, it's like I said, it's so key to look out for each other. Now, you'd mentioned, obviously, you speak to a lot of different people and a lot of different leaders across multiple industries and expertise, etc. And normally I have a question that I ask on the show about favorite episodes, stuff like that, but I want to spin that a little bit differently. Okay. So who, and it doesn't necessarily have to be your show, but who is your favorite leader, an example of leader or a great leadership, and who's your hero of all time and why?
Okay, probably, and I haven't interviewed this individual. I would love the opportunity, but I have spoken with him before, and it's Alan Mulally. He's the former CEO of Ford Motor Company and also the former CEO of Boeing before they had the airplane issue that they're dealing with right now. It was several years ago. Had the opportunity to meet him a couple years ago at a leadership event and had a brief couple-minute conversation with him one-on-one after his talk. Now, I was familiar with him because I grew up in the Detroit area. I know all about Ford Motor Company. My grandfather worked for them. My family, 3 generations, worked for General Motors, had uncles that worked for Chrysler. So I know the auto sector really, really well. And, so he was the keynote for this event. And I'd never heard him. I was familiar with him, but I never heard him speak. And I never really knew some of the backdrop and how he was able to turn Ford Motor Company around at the time that he led the organization. Because when he took over, they were bleeding really badly and all kinds of different things. And his approach to leadership and how he gave permission for his employees to bring him the bad news without repercussion was amazing, because so many people are afraid to go to their boss and say, I think we're going to lose $1 billion in Q3. Well, previous administrations of Ford, they would never report that. They'd hide it. And of course, the numbers would come out and everybody would be shocked, like, how'd this happen? Well, he created a scenario that I want people to come and give me the bad news so we can all talk about it and figure out ways to fix it. And then finally, one of the directors or VPs presented something to him, and it was a loss position, and he stood up and he clapped. And of course, that's not the reaction a lot of people would think would happen, but he stood up and clapped because he said, thank you for being open and transparent and honest with what's really going on. Of course, the next week, everybody else was open and transparent, and it was a sea of red, and that's when things started to change, because then everything was out in the open. They knew what was going on, and then they started making the adjustments to turn things around and make Ford successful again at that time. As, again, growing up in the auto sector, it's a roller coaster. There are some great times, there's some bad, up, down. Of course, the Great Recession was really bad, but and we're seeing now all kinds of adjustments in the auto sector as well. But Mullally is definitely probably someone I would love to interview, and I've heard him talk, and he gives a great talk. As far as my favorite leader of all time, hands down, Winston Churchill. And the reason being, I saw Darkest Hour, and I've followed Churchill and studied him. I look at him sometimes as the accidental leader and or the reluctant leader. There's all kinds of different things that I kind of associate with him. And what he had to do with pretty much a zero buy-in to navigate, the UK through the war. World War II, and the decisions and the things that had to happen exactly the way that they did, and working with the Allies and everything else. Again, with no one believing in him, because when he finally got it, everyone pretty much saying, because he tried to be that role for years and didn't even get close, and all of a sudden here he is, and how he navigated through that and stood up for what he thought was right. Is inspiring. And sometimes, and we know this in leadership, it can be lonely at the top. And the reason they say that is because a lot of people don't buy into your vision and the direction that you want to take an organization or a government or a country. But the resolve that he had was inspiring. And, people ask me if there was one person you'd want to meet in the world, that's no longer here or still here, it would be Prime Minister Churchill.
Interesting. He was obviously a big part from the UK originally, obviously, and he was a big part of our history. One of my favourite lessons at school was history, and that time World War II was a core part of our learning. So I was an interesting choice there. So Michael, this has been really insightful and fascinating chat. I really appreciate you coming on. I know I've taken, my brain's taken over with a lot of the stuff you've been saying. When I'm listening back later, I'm going to be making lots of little side notes, etc. Because it's been an awesome chat. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
For anybody that wants to learn more about your show and what you do, obviously you mentioned you've got your book from 1980, but you've also got the 369 Days How to Survive book as well. If anybody wants to learn more about you, your show, etc., where's the best place for them to find your connect?
Yeah, the best place, breakfastleadership.com, is where you can find me in a lot of different places. On social media, you can find me under the letter B and then Fast Leadership. I'm on all the social media channels. Or if you look up hashtag Breakfast Leadership, you'll be able to find me there. Reach out, send me a note. Happy to connect. Happy to give you any insights as to help people navigate through their burnout. The Breakfast Leadership show is available on all the major platforms. I tend to have episodes releasing every week. Lately, I've been having several episodes a week just to get through the backlog, because there's been a couple interviews that were actually, for some reason, I don't know how they slipped through the cracks, but they were actually before the pandemic, and I'm listening to them going, wow, this is like going in a time machine. This is interesting. We're talking about things that nobody's going to be able to do that right now. What the heck is he talking about? So, I apologize to that guest, and I'm like, yeah, sorry about this one slipping through the cracks, but end of the day, it's still beneficial information. So breakfastleadership.com, probably the best place to find me, and then you can go down the rabbit hole and find me in a bunch of different places from there.
Okay, cool. And obviously, I'll leave all the links to the website and the podcast, etc., in the show notes. So if you're listening on your favorite app, make sure to check out the show notes as usual. And again, Michael, I really appreciate your time today. It's been awesome.
Thank you so much, Danny. Appreciate it.
Okay, so this has been another episode of Podcaster Stories. If you enjoyed this week's show, be sure to share it with anybody that you feel might benefit from, what we've been talking about today. And you can find it on all the main podcast apps like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, etc., as well as podcasterstories.com, where you can even sign up for the newsletter if you wish. Until the next time, take care and stay safe.